The sun dipped low behind the jagged ridgeline, setting the Arizona sky ablaze in blood red and gold. Cole Tanner rode in slow from the far pasture, boots heavy with dust, his shirt clinging with sweat, and his horse, Dusty, swaying beneath him like a tired ghost. The desert was quiet, the kind of quiet a man either feared or came to need. Cole had made peace with it long ago. Out here, no one asked questions. Not about the war, not about Mary, not about the things he saw or the things he did. The quiet let him breathe, let him forget. He was mending a busted fence down near the dry wash, one of those forgotten lines that only mattered to a man trying to keep himself busy enough not to think. That's when he heard it. Not the wind, not a coyote, not the groan of old wood. It was human, a brittle, breathless cry, soft, dying. Cole froze. Rifle in hand, he listened. There it was again, pain, real pain. He moved careful, boots soft against, sun-scorched dirt, eyes scanning every crevice between the thorn brush and mesquite. The land didn't forgive the careless. That's when he saw her, crumbled behind a fallen log like a broken doll. Young, maybe 20. Apache. Her skin was pale, under the filth and blood. Her clothes torn, stained with a wound too deep to ignore. She stirred at his approach, tried to reach for something, her hand scratching at dirt toward a small knife she couldn't reach. He knelt beside her. Calm, low voice. You're hurt. Her eyes, dark, fierce even now, met his. And she said, the words that carved something deep into him. Do it fast, don't make it slow. Cole didn't breathe. He'd seen men beg to live, but never beg to die. Not like that. Not with eyes that already said goodbye. His rifle lowered into the dust. No, he said, voice rough. I ain't doing that. She turned her face, jaw tight. White rancher sees Apache, he pulls the trigger, that's the way of it. Not today, he muttered, already tearing his shirt into strips. He pressed the cloth to her side, felt. Her flinch, heard her mutter something about wasting time. He ignored her. She was light in his arms, light like something fading. Dusty grunted as Cole lifted her into the saddle. Then he rode, hard. The sun fell behind the ridges. Stars came out angry and sharp. Coyotes howled. Wind bit through cloth. She stirred now and then, whispering in Apache, words he couldn't understand. But he didn't need to. Her blood told him enough. By the time the cabin came into sight, Cole's arms ached like hell and his mouth was dry as river bone. But he didn't stop. He laid her on the bed, lit the old lantern, saw the full shape of the wound. Blade sliced. Deep. Cleaned it with hot water, wrapped it tight. She moaned. Her body trembled, but her spirit, somehow, held. He brought her water. Here, he said. She stared, suspicious, confused, but took a sip. Then sleep pulled her under. Cole sat by the fire. The rifle lay across his knees, but his eyes weren't on it. They were on her. This girl, this stranger, this enemy, if you asked the town. But Cole didn't see an enemy. He saw someone who'd been through too much. Maybe that's what pulled at him. Her emptiness matching his. The next morning, the light spilled through the dusty window like gold. She was awake, watching him. Her voice was cracked, but her words cut straight. Why? He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. Why not hand me over? Soldiers pay good coin. Cole shook his head slowly. Don't want their money. You don't even know me. Don't need to, he said simply. You were bleeding. That's all I needed to know. Her eyes searched his face like she was looking for the catch, but she didn't find any. Just a tired man with rough hands and nothing left to lose. He brought her a bit of bread, left it by her side. She didn't touch it at first. Later, when he stepped outside to tend Dusty, she ate silently. That night, when he checked her bandages, her hand caught his wrist. You should have left me, she whispered. There's nothing left of me. Cole looked at her long. Maybe not, but you're still breathing. That counts for something. She didn't argue. Not this time. When she slept, her breath came easier, and for the first time in years, Cole Tanner didn't feel like a ghost in his own home. If this story held your breath the way Cole held hers. Subscribe now for more Wild West tales where mercy costs more than bullets, and silence hides the deepest truths. Mercy don't always look like kindness. Sometimes it bleeds. The cabin was still. Outside, wind whispered through the sagebrush and kicked dust across the porch, but inside, time moved slower than cold molasses. Cole sat near the fire, his eyes drawn to the shape beneath the wool blanket. Asha. That's the name she gave. Apache, young, fire in her bones even when her body was near broke. She hadn't stirred much since the night before, but when she did, it was like watching a hawk that forgot how to fly. Sharp eyes, weak wings. Cole leaned forward, checking her bandage. The wound had stopped weeping, but it still ran deep. Infection lingered in the air. That sick, sweet scent he remembered all too well from battlefield tents and blood-soaked dirt. He hated it. Hated how familiar it felt. Then she woke. Not with fear. No screaming, no thrashing. Just opened her eyes, calm and steady, like she'd accepted whatever hell waited next. Cole didn't say anything. He was used to silence. But she broke it. "You should have let me bleed out," she said, her voice low, dry as sand. Cole didn't flinch. He just folded the cloth in his hands and tossed it into the basin. "Ain't in me." "Why?" she whispered. "Why not end it?" He stood, walked to the stove, poured hot water into a tin cup. His shoulders were tight. You could see it in how he moved, like the weight of the world sat just behind his collarbone. "I've seen enough death," he said. "Ain't looking to add more." She tried to laugh, but it came out more like a wince. White rancher, sees Apache, he pulls the trigger. That's the way it goes. Cole turned and met her eyes. His own were like weathered steel, dented, scratched, but still strong. Not this one. He handed her the cup. Her fingers trembled as she took it. Not from fear, but from fever and pride wrestling inside her bones. She drank slow, eyes never leaving his. "Don't make me your burden," she said. He gave a faint smile, just a twitch in the corner of his mouth. "You ain't." She fell quiet again, and the only sound was the pop of the firewood. Cole sat back down, ran a whetstone over his old hunting knife. The rhythm of it calmed him, like tuning a fiddle that hadn't been played in years. "You were gonna die out there," he said finally. "Didn't sit right with me, still don't." Asha's eyes flickered toward the ceiling. "You think saving me was mercy?" Cole set the blade down. "No," he said. "I think letting you go would have been easy. But mercy? Mercy's the hard road." She didn't speak after that. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside to feed the stock. Dusty greeted him with a snort, nudging his shoulder like he knew something had changed, and maybe it had. Cole hadn't felt purpose in years. Not since Mary. Not since the war made a liar out of every oath he ever swore. But now, he had a wounded girl under his roof and a rifle he hadn't oiled in a month suddenly gleaming near the front door. The wind shifted. He could smell rain somewhere, far off. Trouble wasn't far behind. When he came back inside, Asha was sitting up on the edge of the bed, her legs shaky, face drawn. "You shouldn't be moving yet," he said, setting a bowl of broth down. She looked at him, quiet for a while. "I asked you to kill me," she said. "You gave me soup." He chuckled under his breath, sat down across from her. "Yeah, well, I guess I'm stubborn." A faint smile tugged at her mouth, surprised, reluctant. "I don't want to owe you," she said. "You don't," he replied. "I ain't keeping score." For a long moment, they just sat. No talk. Just firelight and breath and the sound of a world too wide for two people to carry alone. She ate slow, her hands steadier now. And when she finished, she leaned back, eyes on the ceiling again. "You got a name, rancher?" she asked. He looked over, one eyebrow raised. "Cole Tanner." Asha, she said. My father named me after the morning flame. He nodded. Seems fittin', you've still got some burn left. That night, while she slept easier than before, Cole stepped outside. The desert air hit him like a memory, cold and sharp. He looked up at the stars, thousands of them scattered across black like bullet holes in the sky. What the hell are you doing, Tanner? He didn't have the answer. But he knew one thing. This wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving the piece of himself he thought died with Mary. Sometimes it ain't the wound that kills. It's what you believe about the man who bandages it. Morning came in slow through the warped glass window, painting stripes of light across the dusty cabin floor. Asha lay still, the blanket pulled to her chest, watching Cole through half-lidded eyes. He didn't speak, just sat near the stove, mending the strap of an old saddle with the kind of quiet patience forged from years of solitude. She didn't trust him, not really, not yet, but she didn't fear him either, and that was new. Her side ached like hell. The wound was healing, sure, but it throbbed with every breath. Still, the pain was no worse than the questions that wouldn't quit circling her, mind like buzzards. Why was he helping her? Why hadn't he handed her to the soldiers? What did a man like him gain by keeping an Apache girl alive? She tried sitting up. The movement shot a spike of fire down her ribs, and she gritted her teeth to keep from crying out. Cole didn't look up. You push too hard, you'll tear the stitchin'. I'm not made of glass, she muttered, jaw tight. No, he said calmly. You're made of fire, but even fire needs time to catch its breath. That answer caught her off guard. She blinked, lips parting slightly, then said nothing. She hated how steady his voice was, how there was no threat in it, no cruelty, just quiet truth. She leaned back, frustrated with her own body, with her helplessness. You don't even know me. Cole finally looked up. Don't need to. She narrowed her eyes. That's not how your people think. He didn't flinch, just returned to stitching the leather. My people? He said after a long pause. My people died with my wife. The rest? They ain't had nothing to say worth listening to in years. That silence again, heavy as a hanging rope. Asha turned her face toward the ceiling, watching the way sunlight caught the dust in the air. It looked like snow or ashes floating in a beam of gold. When I was little, she said softly, my mother told me that when the wind shifts in the canyon, it carries the voices of our ancestors. If you listen close, they'll tell you what you need to hear. Cole nodded slowly. Maybe that's why I like the wind, it don't lie. Later that day, she managed to stand for a few minutes, leaning against the doorframe. The desert stretched out before her. Red rock, brittle shrubs, mountains so far they looked painted. The sight made her chest ache, not from the wound. From memory. The last time she saw land like this, it had been on fire. Her village, her brothers, her father, Coda, shouting at her to run. She did, and she hadn't stopped running since. Cole noticed her standing there. He didn't rush over. Didn't fuss. Just stepped outside with a cup of water and handed it to her. You ever stop moving long enough to let someone stand with you? He asked. She didn't answer, but she took the water. That night, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Asha sat on the edge of the bed, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Cole was by the hearth sharpening a knife with rhythmic strokes. You said your wife died, she said suddenly. He didn't pause. Fever took her. Wasn't nothing I could do. Asha looked down. My family, soldiers said they came in peace. They brought fire instead. My father and brothers died protecting our home. The fire popped between them. She continued, her voice raw but steady. I ran because I was told to. I survived. But that don't feel like living. Cole looked up, the knife resting in his hand. You made it out, he said. That counts. Does it? She whispered. Hell, yes it does, he said firmly. You ain't just bones and blood, Asha. You've still got fight in you. That means something. For the first time, she didn't push his words away, didn't meet them with sarcasm or steel. She just sat there quiet, letting it sink in. Before turning in, Cole checked her bandage. Her skin flinched under his touch, but she didn't pull away. Not this time. "You're healing," he said. She nodded. "Because you wouldn't let me quit." He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe you were just waiting for someone not to walk away." Asha looked at him then. Really looked. "You're not what I expected," she said. He gave a faint smirk. "Most folks say that before they cuss me out." Asha actually chuckled. Soft, short, but real, and just like that something shifted, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day grow into it. "You don't bury pain out here. You live next to it. Feed it. Ride with it. Or learn to share it." The wind had changed, not the kind that kicks up dust or howls through the trees, but the kind that slips through a man's bones and reminds him he ain't alone anymore. Cole Tanner felt it every time he looked over and saw her sitting near the fire, legs tucked beneath the quilt, eyes following his every move with a cautious kind of quiet. Asha was healing, slow, but steady. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she no longer winced with every breath. She still didn't talk much. Neither did Cole. But they were speaking in their way, in the clatter of dishes being washed, in the soft creak of floorboards passed without a word, in the gentle placing of water near the bed instead of asking if she was thirsty. They moved around each other like two ghosts in a house neither of them built, but both had found shelter in. Each day began the same. Cole rose before dawn, tended to the horses, split wood with that same rhythmic thud that echoed across the dry land. Dusty followed him like an old friend. Asha would wake to the smell of coffee and bacon, her body stiff but her spirit harder to bend. She started helping in small ways, folding laundry, clearing the table, feeding the fire. Cole never told her to, never thanked her either. But he left the tasks easier each time, knowing she'd do them. A full canteen near the stove, a softer log for her to sit on, quiet grace. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was survival, shared. One night, the sky cracked open with stars. Asha sat by the fire, her dark hair loose for once, combing through it slowly. Cole sat across from her, sharpening a blade, eyes catching orange in the lantern light. She broke the silence. "Why do you live alone?" He didn't answer right away, just wiped the blade, stared into the flames like they held something he'd been running from. "Fever took my wife," he said finally. "Mary, sweetest damn thing in this world. After she passed, I stopped wanting to be around people, started wanting to forget." Asha nodded slowly. "Grief makes us ghosts." Cole looked up, surprised by the way she said it. Not like it was poetry, more like it was fact. "You ever been married?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too busy running." Then her voice shifted, her shoulders stiffened, but she spoke anyway. "They came at night," she said. "Soldiers. Said they were bringing peace. My father didn't believe them, but he let 'em in. They waited till the fires were low. Then they lit the tents. My father, Koda, my brothers, Turo and Akai, gone in minutes." Cole didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched her. "I ran," she said. "Not 'cause I was scared, but because my father told me to. I carried his knife, I lost that too." She looked into the fire. Not a single tear fell, but her eyes were wet. "I don't even know who I am without them. Maybe that's why I told you to finish it." A long silence followed. Then Cole set the blade down, reached for the kettle, poured her a cup, handed it to her without a word. She took it. "I never hated your kind until that night," she whispered. Cole's jaw tensed, but he didn't speak. "I expected you to kill me, or turn me in. That's what the world taught me." "I ain't the world," he said softly. "Just a man with regrets." She looked at him like she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. You say that like regrets can grow crops. He smiled faintly. They can't. But sometimes, they keep a man from planting the same mistake twice. Later that night, she stood by the window looking out into the dark. Coyotes howled in the distance, stars blinked overhead. Cole joined her, arms crossed over his chest. You think ghosts can stop haunting a place? She asked. He looked out at the empty plains. Not if you keep feeding them. And what feeds them? He turned to her, voice low. Loneliness, shame, silence. She was quiet for a while, then nodded. Then maybe it's time we starve 'em out. Mercy's easy out in the wild, but standing by it, that's when it starts to cost. The desert didn't breathe easy that morning. The sky was pale, washed out like an old shirt, and the sun hadn't burned off the chill yet. Cole Tanner saddled Dusty without a word, cinching the strap tighter than usual. Asha leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes narrow. You sure about this? She asked. Need supplies, he muttered. We're low on beans. And you're down to half a pouch of herbs. She didn't respond right away. Then softly, they'll look at you different. Cole swung up into the saddle, gave her a calm look. Let him. He didn't kiss her hand, didn't offer promises or warmth. He just tipped his hat low and rode off into the rising light. The town of Dry Creek sat like a blister on the edge of the horizon. One main street, a crooked saloon, Silas Reed's mercantile, and too many mouths with too little to do. Cole rode in slow, Dusty's hooves tapping like warning shots on the hard-packed dirt. It didn't take long. First, the glances, then the silence. Inside the mercantile, Silas was stacking sacks of flour when he saw Cole walk through the door. His eyes flickered. Not fear, not anger, just the quiet kind of judgment men gave when they'd already made up their minds. You looking for anything particular? Silas asked, polite but cold. Flour, dried beans, coffee, salt, and a spool of that thick thread you keep behind the counter. Silas nodded and moved to collect the items. Cole waited, eyes fixed on the door, jaw tight. Behind him he heard whispering. 2 old men, 1 woman with a baby. Nobody said his name, but the air said enough. When he stepped outside, bags in hand, the whispers followed like crows. Then came the voice. Been hearing things, Tanner. Cole turned. Hank Dobbs, wide in the chest, narrow in the mind, mean in the way only bored men could be. He stood on the porch of the saloon, boots crossed, toothpick dancing between his teeth. You keeping company with an Apache? Hank's grin was sharp. Cole didn't blink. Folks say a lot of things. Hank pushed off the post and stepped closer. Yeah, they do. Funny thing is, usually where there's smoke, there's fire. You really letting one of them shack up at your place? Cole's jaw set like stone. You should get back to your drink, Dobbs. Hank smiled wide. I ain't drinking. Just watching. You forget who you are, Cole. You ain't one of them. You're one of us. Cole stepped forward, his boots heavy on the boards. He stopped inches from Hank and said, real quiet. I ain't yours, Dobbs. Never was. For a second, nobody moved. Then Hank chuckled, but there was a twitch in his eye that didn't match his mouth. You're gonna regret this. She'll bring fire to your doorstep. Cole stepped down into the dirt, tossed the bags across Dusty's saddle, and rode out. Didn't look back, but he knew. Trouble wasn't coming. It was already saddled up. Tiwar. Ride home was long, wind in his face, hat low, dust in his throat. But his mind wasn't on the land. It was on what waited ahead. When the cabin came into view, he saw Asha outside, hanging damp linens across the line. The breeze caught her braid, lifted it like a ribbon. She turned when she heard the hooves. One look at his face and her eyes darkened. They know, she said. Not a question. Cole dismounted, jaw tight. They suspect. They'll come. I know. She looked away, fists clenched. You shouldn't have helped me. Cole stepped close, voice like granite. But I did. I bring trouble. He stared at her, slow and steady. Then trouble found the right man. I've lived through war, Asha. I've buried every damn thing that ever meant something to me. You think I'm afraid of Hank Dobbs and his barroom boys? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. You don't understand what happens when white men fear what they don't control. He laid a hand on her shoulder, firm, not soft. Then let him come. I ain't hiding you. I'm standing with you. That makes you my responsibility now. She looked up at him, wounded, wary, but not alone. For the first time in years. Not alone. That night, the fire burned lower than usual. Cole sat cleaning his rifle. Asha stitched the seam of her dress. No words passed between them. They didn't need to. Outside, the desert wind carried dust and warning. Inside, 2 lives were preparing for the storm. Some lines are drawn in ink, others in blood. But the ones that matter most are drawn in dust. The night passed with no knock on the door, no gunshots from the trees, but sleep never came easy. Cole Tanner sat by the window long after the fire burned low, the butt of his Winchester resting against his thigh, boots still on. His eyes scanned the ridgeline, watching for the silhouettes of men too cowardly to face daylight. Asha slept in the corner cot, breathing steady. But her brow was tight, her jaw clenched. Even in dreams, she didn't trust peace. By dawn, she was already outside, barefoot in the chill morning dirt, staring out at the open desert like it might swallow everything whole. Cole stepped onto the porch, the creak of the old wood giving him away. She didn't turn. They'll come, she said softly. I know. They won't knock. No, they won't. She turned then, face sharper than the wind. You shouldn't have stood up for me. You've made yourself a target. Cole leaned against the porch beam, arms folded. I've been a target most my life. This ain't new. Asha shook her head, frustration bubbling. You don't get it. I was born to be hunted. You weren't. You chose this. He let the silence hang, let the weight of her words settle like dust on the floorboards. I didn't choose you, he said finally. I chose what was right. And now that choice has a name. It's yours. By mid-morning, the cabin felt smaller, tighter. Asha stood in the kitchen, cleaning a tin plate that had already been scrubbed twice. Her hands moved, but her mind wasn't there. I can go, she said, without looking up. Cole was near the fire, reloading rounds into his rifle with steady fingers. You're not going anywhere. If I leave now, maybe they back off. You leave now, he said, and they hunt you alone. I ain't letting that happen. She slammed the plate down, finally looking at him. Why? What do you owe me? Cole stood, not rushed, not angry, just heavy. You asked me once why I didn't finish you out there in the wash, and I gave you a half answer. Truth is, I saw a girl who'd been thrown away. Same way I felt after Mary passed, and maybe, just maybe, helping you was a way to claw back a piece of my soul. Asha's shoulders dropped. Her fire didn't fade, but it softened. I don't want to be your redemption, she said. You're not, he replied. You're my responsibility, that's different. The wind picked up in the afternoon, dry and biting. A hawk circled high above, riding invisible currents. Cole set about reinforcing the cabin doors. Asha followed without being asked. They moved like a team, unspoken tasks, measured glances. She checked the windows, stuffed cracks with cloth. He laid a second rifle near the back door. Loaded both. Later, she found him repairing a hinge on the barn. His face was drawn, jaw clenched, like a man building a coffin, but hoping it wouldn't be needed. She touched his shoulder. You don't have to bleed for me. Cole looked at her, eyes like steel baked under too many suns. I already did. Just haven't spilled it yet. That night they ate in silence, beans and stale bread. The kind of meal you only eat when your thoughts are too loud for words. Asha looked up from her tin plate. You ever kill a man? Cole didn't flinch. More than I care to count. Because you had to? Or because you could? He looked into the fire, shadows flickering over the scars on his hands. Both. She nodded. If they come, I won't run this time. He looked at her then, saw the steel in her spine, the same defiant flicker he saw when he first found her behind that log, bloody but unbroken. You sure you can shoot? He asked. My father taught me. She paused. Not just how to shoot, when to shoot. Cole gave a slow nod, then walked over to the cabinet, pulled out his oldest rifle, wood dark, worn smooth by years. He handed it to her. It kicks hard, he said, like a mule with something to say. I'll listen, she replied. Outside, the desert slept, but not peacefully. There was tension in the air, like the land itself was waiting to see what kind of men would show up when the blood moon rose. Inside, two strangers, one white, one Apache, loaded rifles in silence. Not as enemies, not even just survivors, but as something new, something dangerous to the old rules, together. There's a moment right before a man draw when the whole world holds its breath. Dawn came slow and blood-red. The sky stretched wide like God had dragged a blade across the edge of the world. Coyotes had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to hunker low. Cole Tanner was already on the porch, rifle resting across his knees. He hadn't slept. Not really. Just sat there in the dark, listening to the creak of old wood and the beat of his own heart. Inside the cabin, Asha lit the stove with quiet hands. She didn't hum, didn't whisper to the fire like she used to. This morning, silence was armor. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Distant at first, faint like a drum behind the hills, but growing. Steady. Determined. Cole stood slowly, cocked the rifle, and watched the horizon. Asha stepped onto the porch beside him, her braid tied tight, face calm. She held the old rifle he'd given her the night before, cradled close like it belonged there. They're early, she said. Cole didn't blink. Cowards always come before breakfast, makes them feel bigger. She gave a faint, humorless smile. Then let's see how big they feel when we answer back. 5 riders crested the ridge. Dust trailed behind them, glowing orange in the rising light. At the front rode Hank Dobbs. He wore a black duster today, as if the theatrics would make him more righteous. His mustache twitched with arrogance. The men behind him, town trash with nothing better to do, wore the look of folks who'd already convinced themselves they were doing the good thing. Cole stepped off the porch and stood in the dirt, the morning sun casting a long shadow behind him. Morning, Tanner, Hank called, reining in just short of the fence line. We figured we'd pay a neighborly visit. Cole said nothing, just rested his thumb near the hammer of his rifle. Been some talk in town, Hank continued. Some mighty strong concerns about who you're harboring out here. You came to gossip or to trespass? Cole asked, voice flat. Hank's grin soured. We came to make sure there ain't trouble brewing under your roof. At that, the cabin, door opened. Asha stepped out, tall, shoulders square, the rifle held at her side but not hidden. Her dark eyes found Hank's, steady as stone. No flinch, no apology. The effect was immediate. One of Hank's men shifted in his saddle. Another spat into the dust, nervous. Well, Hank said after a pause, ain't that something? I thought maybe the stories were just that. But look at you, doing exactly what folks feared, protecting the enemy. Cole took a single step forward. She's done nothing wrong. Hank's lip curled. Her people burned wagons, raided homesteads, killed children. And yours burned tents and killed fathers in the name of peace, Asha said calmly, her voice slicing through the morning like a blade. The men stiffened. Cole raised his rifle slightly, not aiming yet, but damn near. Turn around, Hank. Take your boys with you. Hank's eyes flicked between them. He hadn't expected her to stand tall. He hadn't expected Cole to mean it. Last chance, Tanner, Hank said, the grin gone. You step aside, we'll take her quiet. No one needs to bleed. Cole didn't move. If you want blood, you best be ready to spill some of your own. A beat passed, then another. And Hank, for all his bluster, hesitated. He looked into Cole's eyes and saw something that made his gut go cold. Not rage, not bravado, but conviction. A man with nothing left to lose, and everything worth protecting right behind him. He sneered. "This ain't over," Hank growled. Then with a yank of the reins he turned. The others followed. The sound of their retreat faded over the ridge, swallowed by the desert silence. Cole let out a slow breath, the kind you only take when the hammer stays unpulled. Asha stepped beside him, the rifle still warm in her hands. "You think they'll be back?" He nodded. "Like flies to a carcass." Her jaw tightened. "Next time, they won't talk first." "I know." She looked up at him. "Then we'd better be ready." He met her gaze. "We already are." Some nights it ain't about courage. It's about deciding whose breath gets to see morning. The storm hadn't come yet, but everything said it was close. The wind had teeth. The sky turned the color of rust. The birds, what few remained, had gone silent. Cole Tanner watched the horizon from the edge of the corral, hand resting on Dusty's withers. His mind wasn't on chores anymore, wasn't on cattle or water lines or fence posts. It was on the men he knew would ride again, sooner, louder, meaner. He walked back toward the cabin, boots crunching in gravel, shoulders heavy with the knowledge that the time for hoping had passed. Inside, Asha stood at the kitchen table, sorting through bullets with steady hands. Her movements were slow but sure, like someone who had long since made peace with the idea of killing but never enjoyed the thought of it. "They'll come at night," she said without turning. "Yeah," Cole muttered. "Men like that don't fight under God's sun. They wait for shadows to do their coverin'." She slid a box across the table. 36 rounds, I checked each one, they won't jam." Cole gave a small nod. "You sure you're up for this?" She looked up, those dark eyes fierce, almost glowing in the lantern light. "I begged you to let me die once," she said. "I won't beg again." They spent the afternoon preparing. Cole dug shallow trenches outside the windows, just deep enough to catch a foot, or slow a man with murder on his mind. Asha moved inside, clearing, lines of sight, pulling the rug back from the floorboards to keep her steps quiet. They barricaded the doors, reinforced the shutters, positioned the rifles. Not out of paranoia, but purpose. Each step was a message. This place will not fall easy. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and purple, Cole leaned the second rifle against the window ledge and stepped back. Asha stood across the room, rolling up her sleeves. "You ever been in a shootout?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only wars. Back then you aimed at a color, not a face." She nodded, like she understood more than he'd said. "Then tonight," she said, "you aim at the men who chose this." Night fell hard, the kind of black that swallowed everything but the lantern light. The wind picked up, coyotes cried in the distance, then hooves. Again, this time slower. No banter, no talk, just intent. Cole stood on the porch, rifle gripped tight. Asha was in the loft window, crouched behind stacked feed sacks, her silhouette barely visible in the candlelight. From the trees came 5 riders. Same horses, same men. But this time, they weren't looking for conversation. Hank Dobbs rode, in front, shotgun resting across his lap. The others fanned out like wolves around a kill. "You got one last chance, Tanner," he called into the night. "Hand her over. Let's not make this messy." Cole didn't answer, so Hank raised his shotgun, and the night cracked open. The first blast tore through the edge of the porch rail. Cole ducked and fired back. One shot, clean and fast. It missed, but it sent them scattering. Then came Asha's shot, from the loft, sharp, deliberate. One of Hank's men yelped and dropped from his saddle. The war had started. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Cole moved from window to door, squeezing off rounds with the patience of a man who'd already buried too many mistakes. Asha covered the flanks from above, her rhythm precise. There was no panic in her, only fire. One man tried to flank through the barn. Asha caught him with a shot to the leg. He screamed and crawled. Cole finished the warning with a bullet in the dirt near his hand. "Run," he growled, and he did. The skirmish lasted less than 10 minutes. But 10 minutes in the dark with lead flying and breath held feels like a lifetime. When the last of the riders peeled off and disappeared into the trees, Cole didn't relax. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle still raised, eyes scanning the tree line. The desert was quiet again, until Asha opened the door behind him. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked down. His shirt sleeve was soaked through, a shallow graze. "I've had worse," he said, wincing as the adrenaline drained from his veins. She stepped forward, helped him back inside, and laid him on the cot. Her hands moved fast, cleaning, pressing, wrapping like she'd done it before. He looked at her through the haze of pain. "You didn't have to stay in that window." She met his gaze. "You didn't have to stand on that porch." They sat by the fire later, quiet and raw. No victory speeches, no celebration, just the kind of silence that means we made it. A man can outrun a bullet, but not what he feels when the shooting stops. The night had given up its rage, but not its silence. The fire in the hearth crackled low, sending shadows dancing along the cabin walls. Cole sat in the old rocker, one arm wrapped tight in a bandage that bled through at the edge. His breath came slow, like each pull of air carried the weight of 10 winters. Across from him, Asha leaned forward on the table, fingers tracing a cracked line in the wood. Her hair, still braided, hung down over her shoulder. Her face was lit only by the flame, and in that light she looked like something half ghost, half warrior. Neither of them spoke. Not yet. Because sometimes, when the storm passes, the stillness is louder than the guns ever were. Outside, Dusty snorted softly in the corral. The wind had settled into a slow crawl over the hills, brushing against the barn as if trying to apologize for all it had carried hours earlier. Cole finally broke the silence. That shot from the loft. He turned to look at her. "You saved me." Asha didn't smile. She just nodded. "I didn't do it for you," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I did it for me." That made him grin. Just a little. "That so?" She nodded again. "For the first time in a long while, I wanted to live." She got up and poured a bit of coffee from the pot on the stove, handed him a cup. It was bitter and black, but he took it gratefully. He sipped once, then asked, "What happens now?" Asha took a long moment to answer. "They'll be back," she said. "Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not for weeks. But men like Dobbs don't lose quiet." Cole looked down at the steam rising from his mug. "I've got one more cow, 2 chickens, and half a sack of flour. Ain't much worth dying for." She stepped closer, resting a hand on the back of his chair. Her voice softened. "They're not coming for the chickens, Cole. They're coming for me." There it was. The truth he'd been trying not to look at straight on since the day she'd stumbled onto his land, wounded and half dead. "You think you ought to go," he said flatly. "I don't want to," she replied, her eyes locked on his. "But I can't keep bringing danger to your door. It ain't fair." He set the cup down, stared into the fire. Fair left this place a long time ago. They sat again, the quiet growing thick between them. Cole finally stood, walked to the door, opened it, and looked out at the hills. The stars were bright tonight, too bright, like they knew something was about to change. "I don't know much about right or wrong anymore," he said. "But I do know what a man can stand to lose." He turned to her, voice steady. "And I don't aim to lose you, Asha." Her breath hitched. She took a slow step forward, every inch between them weighted with meaning. Her hands were rough, scarred from survival, but when she reached for his, they were gentle. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. "I never been more." She looked down, then back up, a flicker of emotion rising behind her eyes. Pain, hope, fear, all at once. "You still got room for someone like me?" He laughed, a tired, honest laugh. "I got a roof that leaks and a bed that squeaks. But yeah, I reckon I got room. The wind picked up again, soft this time, not carrying danger, just the kind of wind that moves stories forward. Asha leaned her head against his chest. He held her like he'd been waiting to do it for years, for the first time in what felt like forever. The night felt like something close to peace. A man can walk 1,000 miles and never outrun who he really is. The sun was just breaking over the horizon when Cole Tanner stepped out onto his porch. The chill of dawn clung to the air, but he didn't feel it. Not with the weight he carried in his chest. Beside him, Asha stood still, arms folded tight, her eyes fixed on the winding trail that led up over the ridge. Dusty pawed at the earth, restless, ears twitching like he knew something was coming. Because something was. And this time it wasn't just trouble. It was the end of something that had been hanging in the air for too long. Cole had spent the night sharpening his rifle and quieter thoughts. He wasn't a fool. He knew Silas Reed wouldn't leave things unfinished. The man was patient, cold, and worse, righteous. He'd seen too many men like that in the war. They didn't sleep until the job was done, no matter who they had to bury along the way. Asha had wanted to leave at first light, but Cole wouldn't have it. "We don't run," he said. "Not anymore." She didn't argue. She just nodded and loaded her revolver. It wasn't long before the sound of hooves echoed. Down the ridge, 6 riders, all in black. And at the front, Silas Reed. He looked just the same, like a man carved from judgment. Cold steel eyes, a mouth that never smiled unless something broke. His coat flapped in the wind like a preacher's robe. He rode forward alone, stopping just outside the fence line. Cole stepped down from the porch. His rifle was slung across his back, but his hand didn't move for it. "Silas," he said. "Tanner." Silas looked past him, toward Asha. "You really gonna die for her?" "No," Cole replied. "I'm gonna live with her, and you're not taking that from me." Silas didn't blink. "She's Apache, she's a fugitive, you know what she did." "I know exactly what she did, she survived." Cole's voice cracked like old wood, full of fire and truth. "She nursed my land back to life, fed my animals, pulled lead from my shoulder. She bled for this place." "You call that a threat?" "I call it a miracle." The silence that followed was thick, brittle. Silas turned his head slightly, like he was weighing something. Then he gave the signal. It all happened in seconds. Shots rang out like thunder across dry earth. Dust flew. Cole dropped to one knee, rifle up, barking rounds like a man possessed. Asha moved like wind, smooth and sharp, picking targets, ducking, low behind the water trough, her breath steady. When the dust settled, 4 men lay wounded. 2 had fled, and Silas Reed was on the ground, bleeding from the shoulder. Not dead, but broken. Cole stood over him. "Next time you want to judge someone," he growled, "take a long, hard look in the mirror first." He walked away. Didn't shoot, didn't spit, just walked. Because some victories ain't loud. That night, the wind carried no fear. Cole and Asha sat by the fire again, this time not to hide or prepare for war, but just to be. The kind of silence that wrapped around them was warm, honest. He looked at her as she leaned against him, eyes half closed. "You reckon we'll ever stop looking over our shoulder?" she asked. He shrugged. "Maybe. But even if we don't, long as we're looking together, I'm all right with that." Spring came early that year, and with it, wildflowers on the hill, the kind that grow only after fire. Asha planted vegetables in the garden. Cole fixed the barn roof, though it still squeaked when it rained. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind blew just right, they could almost forget how close they came to losing everything. Because in the West, survival ain't the same as living. And sometimes love don't come with a wedding ring. It comes with a loaded rifle, a stubborn heart, and a choice to stay when walking away would have been easier. So now it's your turn. Would you risk everything to protect someone the world says you shouldn't love? Would you stand on that porch, weapon in hand, heart wide open? Or would you ride away, wondering what could have been? Subscribe now to ride into more untold Wild West stories. The dust may settle, but out here, the heart never does.